Imagine this. The sky is opening. The world is shaking out of place. And then, from far away, you hear the sound of hooves. A white horse, a red horse, a black horse, a pale horse, the color of death itself. For thousands of years, these riders have shaped humanity's deepest fears. We call them the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. But the real question is this: are they literal riders of the end times? Or do they carry one of history's deepest political, spiritual, and psychological warnings? Popular culture turned them into monsters. Memes turned them into symbols. Films turned them into spectacle. But when we reach their true origin, we find that this is not just a story about the end of the world. It is a story about empire, violence, scarcity, and death, a cycle that every generation may face again. To understand the Four Horsemen, we first have to understand Revelation. It is the final book of the New Testament, and in Christian tradition it is associated with a visionary figure named John, who was exiled on the island of Patmos. According to Britannica, Revelation was an apocalyptic response written to strengthen the church during a time of persecution. Its message was clear: what you see now is not the final reality. Apocalyptic literature speaks in a strange language: beasts, numbers, angels, cosmic disasters, hidden meanings. This is the kind of language people use when speaking openly becomes dangerous. In other words, when empire becomes too powerful, truth is often spoken through symbols. Bible Project also emphasizes that Revelation should not be read as a secret timeline of the future. It should be understood as a symbolic critique of human kingdoms, because every kingdom that makes itself absolute eventually becomes Babylon. The Four Horsemen did not appear out of nowhere. Their imagery has an older background in the Hebrew Bible, especially in the book of Zechariah. Britannica notes that Zechariah includes visions of apocalyptic horsemen, or horse imagery, connected to God's action in history and the future restoration of Jerusalem. That means John was not inventing a brand new image. He was reusing an older prophetic language for a new crisis. That matters because when the riders appear in Revelation, we should not treat them as simple horror creatures. They are part of a much older tradition of prophecy, a symbolic language capable of compressing judgment, warning, history, and divine sovereignty into a single unforgettable image. According to Revelation 6, the first rider appears on a white horse. He carries a bow, he is given a crown, and he rides out conquering and to conquer. It sounds straightforward, but throughout history, this rider has been the most debated of them all. Britannica explains that this first rider is often linked with Conquest. But because he rides a white horse, some interpreters have also associated him with Christ, while others have seen him as a deceptive or even Antichrist-like figure. In other words, the very first horseman is also the most controversial. And that is an important point for any serious documentary. We should not pretend there has only ever been one interpretation. The most honest way to present this rider is to say that the mainstream summary links him to Conquest, but the tradition contains multiple readings. The second seal opens. A red horse appears. This rider is given the power to take peace from the earth, and what follows is violence, slaughter, and bloodshed. He is given a great sword. Across most interpretations, this rider represents war. But the imagery is more brutal than simple battlefield conflict. In Revelation, war is not just a military event. It is the breaking of peace itself. The moment trust collapses, the moment society turns against itself, the moment people begin destroying one another, the red horse is already riding. The third seal opens. The rider on the black horse appears holding scales in his hand. Then a voice declares the price of wheat and barley in terms of a full day's wages. This is not just a picture of hunger. It is a picture of economic collapse. Food still exists, but survival has become so expensive that ordinary people begin to break under the cost. Britannica links this rider to famine. But the scales suggest something even more disturbing. A world where justice has given way to rationing, where the market becomes more powerful than mercy, and where suffering is not shared equally. The black horse is not only about hunger. It is also about unequal suffering. Then comes the fourth rider, the pale horse. Revelation tells us his name directly: Death. and Hades follows close behind him. This is the most direct, most final, and most terrifying rider of all. War and famine naturally lead toward death, but Revelation presents death as a force with its own terrible presence. Britannica identifies the fourth horseman explicitly as death, and later art historians, including writers from Smart History and the Met, note that many artists place this rider in the foreground, because visually, this is where the terror reaches its climax. One of the most powerful things about the horsemen is not just who they are individually, but the order in which they come. First conquest, then war, then famine, then death. This does not feel random. Feels like a chain reaction. Empire expands. Conflict spreads. Supply systems collapse. Hunger follows. And then death consumes what remains. Bible Project interprets this imagery as a symbolic pattern, a way of showing oppressed communities how violence moves through history. Revelation may not simply be describing a future disaster. It may also be exposing the logic of collapse in the present. When the Middle Ages and early modern Europe read Revelation, the Four Horsemen did not remain abstract symbols. They became part of collective fear. In times of plague, war, famine, and religious crisis, people did not experience these riders as distant theological ideas. They felt like mirrors of the world around them. In 1498, the artist Albrecht Dürer created his famous woodcut, The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. According to the Smithsonian, this public domain masterpiece shows four armed riders crashing down upon humanity. And according to both Smart History and the Met, Dürer filled the scene with motion, terror, and diagonal force, turning it into one of the most iconic apocalyptic images in Western art. Revelation had been illustrated before Dürer, but after Dürer, the Four Horsemen no longer belonged only to Scripture. They became part of visual civilization itself. Over time, the meaning of the Four Horsemen continued to shift. Some saw them as direct predictions of the end times. Some understood them as coded critiques of historical empires. Others saw them as recurring symbols of disaster that return in every age. And that may be the secret of their power. They feel new every time history enters crisis. That is why people still reach for the language of the horsemen whenever they see war, inflation, food shortages, disease, or social collapse. Why? Because their imagery is no longer only religious. It has become psychologically universal. Today, the Four Horsemen are everywhere: films, comics, metal album covers, fantasy novels, video games, memes. Sometimes they appear as literal villains, sometimes as anti-heroes, sometimes as supernatural bosses, sometimes as moral metaphors. But there is a subtle danger in that transformation. The more aesthetic they become, the less we feel the original warning. In the biblical text, the horsemen were not cool fantasy characters. They were compressed theology, an unforgettable warning that conquest can produce war, war can produce hunger, and hunger can produce death. And perhaps the most frightening part is this: that pattern does not feel ancient at all. So what does the entire history of the Four Horsemen really tell us? That they are not only monsters of the future. They are recurring nightmares of human history. Whenever conquest is glorified, whenever peace collapses, whenever food becomes a privilege, whenever death begins to feel ordinary, the horsemen are no longer only in Revelation. They are in the world. That is why the Four Horsemen remain timeless. Their deepest terror is not dragons, fire, or supernatural spectacle. Their deepest terror is recognition. Perhaps the purpose of Revelation was never just to frighten people. Perhaps it was to reveal the pattern of collapse, so that human beings could see it clearly and decide whether they would become part of that cycle or resist it.